Well, when we are thinking of the Constitution, it's not only the text, of course, that is important, but it is also, what is important is also the background with and the objectives particularly which the Constitution makers had in mind. So first we must go back to the freedom movement and what was promised to the Indian people in the freedom movement. That was propounded by nationalist leaders from time to time, but especially in the Karachi resolution of 1930s. This was the resolution passed by the Indian National Congress session at Karachi, in which the objective was to show to the Indian people what would happen once the country is free. So, for instance, equal rights of women with men was first provided in this resolution. Women would have full equality with men. Land reform was promised. It was not said that zamindari would be abolished totally, but it was promised that relief would be given to the peasants, and it was implied that there would be control over what rents the zamindars drew. And ultimately that led to the demand for zamindari abolition, which was fulfilled later on after independence, or beginning with the Congress governments, provincial governments, which came into power in 1945-46 in the provinces. So the Karachi resolution must be borne in mind when we think of the Constitution. What was promised there? A proper deal was promised to the minorities. Workers' rights would be protected, and there would be some sort of control over both landlords and what capitalists could do, and a series of other democratic rights were promised. So when the time came for India to frame its constitution immediately after 15th of August, then it must be remembered that to the Congress leadership, the promises of Karachi resolution were very much in mind. At the same time, there was the background of British parliamentary legislation laying down how the governments were to function in the provinces and in the center. And this kind of legislation had become more and more complex, laying down what would be regarded by constitution readers in other countries as details which need not enter the constitution. But they were the details that had already entered the constitution, the constitutional laws passed by British Parliament for India, the Government of India Act 1918 and the Government of India Act 1935. Huge volumes. So there were two inheritances, I would say. One was from the national movement. These things have to be done, and whatever the constitution, they must provide for that. I have just mentioned a few: education, equal rights for women and women, protection of rights of the untouchables, now called the scheduled castes. The transfer of land to the peasants. These were the major demands in mind, and of course parliamentary government, parliamentary democracy, very much modelled after that of England. These were the basic issues or basic things which the constitution makers, who were mainly from the Congress party, of course, despite the fact that Ambedkar was the chairman of the drafting committee, but mainly these were Congress draftsmen, apart from the expert draftsmen who drafted the laws and so forth, who were also involved. So the constitution is a result of that. This mixture of both is present in the length of the constitution, which is like the Government of India Act of 1935 and earlier legislations, which provide for very minor details. At the same time, it has a vision which the earlier legislations or constitutional laws lacked. So it is both the vision of the Indian Constitution and its democratic provisions which are of great importance for us. Now, already in the Karachi resolution, the total voting rights had been promised to all adults, men and women, which was never the case with the British period legislation. And I must remember that even when the Indian Constitution was being drafted, not everybody thought that every adult man and woman would have a vote. So first of all, the Constitution secured us democratic rights. It envisioned a parliamentary democracy. It envisioned all adults to be voters. And it did not, it modified a particular feature of the earlier legislation, that was communal electorates, that is to say Hindus and Muslims voted in different electorates throughout the country. That was abolished, but the provision for scheduled castes was maintained. So there was a small minority which argued for proportional representation, but that was not found workable. It is of course arguable whether now, with the kind of facilities available, with many European countries shifting to proportional representation, whether this would not be a workable idea. But at the time, 1949, when the Constitution was being drafted, it was not thought that proportional representation could be practicable. So the Constitution envisioned a parliamentary democracy with all adult franchise, and all power was then transferred to the representatives, they democratically elected, whether in the states, as provinces were now to be called, or in the central parliament, particularly what was called the House of the People in the original English version of the Constitution. And the other house was called Council of States. It's important to realize that at that time very few people thought that it would be immediately possible to hold elections. But in fact, The first elections came in 1952, within 2 years of the proclamation of the Constitution. So I think that achievement is to be celebrated. Such a large electorate and a totally free and fair election. Now, in the Constitution, there is a difference with others. Generally, in the British tradition, constitutions provide for the administrative structure or the structure of representation. Of course, British Constitution is not, a large part of the British Constitution is not in the form of any law, but just in the form of convention. But I am speaking of the American Constitution or constitutions of other countries like those of France. The Constitution is generally short and provides for general principles. They are then interpreted. The Indian Constitution, on the other hand, follows the way of the British legislation, that it provides for very minor details, but at the same time it goes beyond British legislation by providing for objectives and purposes. For example, the whole section on objectives of state policy and other provisions. For instance, the provision that the governor must of the state must accept the legislation with some provision passed by the state assemblies. Of course, that is now being controverted, but you can see from the original constitution that it was expected that the governor would simply follow the advice of the ministers in the state. So, the constitution looked forward to a federal structure. That was first thing. And when the states within their areas would have autonomy. Now, that was a very interesting thing to do, because at that time the Congress party was practically in power in all states. In fact, it was Kerala for the first time in which a non-Congress government, if I am not mistaken, took office. But even so, the Constitution provides for a fair amount of provincial or state autonomy. Then the Constitution also laid down certain objectives. A civil code with equal rights for men and women was provided, objectives of state policy. Cow protection was also provided. But so that was a peculiar Indian addition to constitution making. There were other provisions which could not be embodied into law at that time, but they were set out so that laws in these fields, if passed in future, would be protected by the Constitution. That particular section has that virtue, that in a large fields where they lay down what law could be passed, that areas would be protected by the Constitution. And any law passed in that field could not therefore be declared unconstitutional. Consistent with the general way that the constitutional documents earlier, Government of India Acts and so forth, the Constitution did not state general principles very much, except for this particular section, directions for state policy, in which were desirable objectives but not enforceable at the time of the Constitution. But otherwise, the Constitution followed mainly the kind of structure that was made available by the Government of India Acts, except that, for instance, where the Government of India Act 1935 gave discretionary powers to the provincial governors the governors of the states were deprived of those discretionary powers by the Constitution. So our Constitution, although very long and perhaps including provisions which at that time it looked the Constitution need not have been burdened with, is not an easy document to read. For instance, it is possible to ask every American citizen to read the Indian Constitution, but it would be an imposition for us to ask every Indian to read the Indian Constitution. I'm sorry, Americans generally read the US Constitution because it's a short document, but you can hardly ask an Indian today to read the Indian Constitution, which is a whole volume. Nevertheless, I think considering the conditions in India, it was prudent to lay down almost all kinds of provisions. Because we are seeing today that although the Constitution actually says in so many words that the governors should accept what the elected ministers want, nevertheless the governors are denying in many states the authority of the ministers. So in fact, the democratic structure promised by the Constitution is being openly subverted. Today, and therefore it is very important for citizens to understand what the Constitution contains, and also there have been certain amendments which should also be borne in mind, particularly, for instance, in the preamble, the objective of making India a secular and socialist republic must also be borne in mind. The Constitution makers, or at least the authors of the amendments who put it into the Constitution, had a particular vision for India. They might not mean by socialist what economists fully mean, but they had a vision where the exploited classes, the poor, would be particularly served by the state, and land would be distributed among the peasants, as in fact took place, and there would be some control over the propertied classes. I think that was broadly their intention when they put the word socialist there. But they also put secular, and I think it is very important that when India was partitioned, the Indian national leadership did not accept the proposition. For instance, what G.D. Birla put before Sardar Patel, that India should be a Hindu state. And I think it is best to remember that what Sardar Patel's answer was. He said if he knew that India would be a Hindu state, he would not have gone to jail for that. So the Constitution therefore put secularism. Throughout the Constitution you can see that the secular spirit is manifest, but then in the amendment also India is declared to be a secular republic. Now we can see today whether in fact we are fulfilling that demand of the Constitution, because those who say or go about saying that this chap and that by talking about sovereignty has violated the Constitution, state sovereignty, they forget that every day they speak in communal terms, they are defying the Constitution of India, which demands that India should be a totally secular state. So I think it is very important for us today to study what the Constitution stands for and to demand that there should not be only an loyalty to the Constitution in words, but that loyalty should be expressed all the time in practice.